Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our talks with Walt as we now work our way through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And we are starting from Paumanok section 16 out of the 19 sections. Now this is one of the more really difficult sections of Leaves of Grass that we're going to have to deal with, because we're going to meet Whitman and what is sometimes referred to in the scholarly literature as the Indian problem or the Native American question. And we're going to have to deal with the fact that Whitman, along with most of the people of his time, were of course going to have a certain kind of racist view towards the native inhabitants of the Americas. Now, before we address this poem and the reading of this section 16, my assumption is that you've been with us at learnstrong.net in that folder called Talks with Walt, down the left-hand side, for all of the 24 inscription poems as well as the first 15 poems of, or sections of, starting from Paumanok. Now, as we said already, if we are the stories that we tell and we retell, and we are the stories that we decide to either accept or to reject, when we meet this passage and several other kinds of passages in Leaves of Grass, from Far Dakota's canyons, the poem Osceola is going to be a difficult one for us. Song of the Redwood Tree, as well as Salute au Monde. We're going to find ourselves dealing with the Native American question, and often Whitman will in fact represent Native Americans as inferior, as somehow incapable of assimilating into popular culture, modern culture, if you will. And he will speak sometimes of them in a derogatory fashion. Other times, he will simply mention them in passing, as he will do here. Now, our goal, as we have said about anything that we study in 303 together, is to show respect. We can still read Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and study it and respect it, in spite of the fact that, yes, the man who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness," owned slaves himself. We don't run away from the conundrums of history, certainly American history or world history, and so as we pick up this set of lines, we're going to be struggling, obviously, to show respect to, obviously and clearly, certain kinds of racist tendencies that Whitman will have as he obviously adopted from the culture at large. It's not an excuse, but we certainly want to say it out loud. Passage 16. On my way, a moment, I pause, here for you and here for America. Still the present I raise aloft, still the future of the states I harbinge, glad and sublime. And for the past, I pronounce what the air holds of the Red Aborigines. The Red Aborigines, leaving natural breath, sounds of rain and winds, calls as of birds and animals in the woods, syllable to us for names: Okini, Coosa, Ottawa, Monongahela, Sauk, Natchez, Chattahoochee, Caqueta, Oronco, Wabash, Miami, Saginaw, Chippewa, Oshkosh, Walla Walla. Leaving such to the states, they melt, they depart, charging the water and the land with names. Now, obviously, this is a distressing set of lines for us to read today. I should point out that when Whitman publishes a set of lines like this, for many readers it's controversial because he appears to be in some way celebrating conquered peoples. And the obvious question is, why are we celebrating conquered peoples? Of course, today, as we will read a set of lines like this, especially the final lines of this section 16, the very fact that as we go through these names of these different Indian, Native American tribes, there will be a number of them that even if you Google search this information, you will find relatively nothing there about these peoples because, of course, their tribes, their histories often exterminated, and this obviously will be for us tragic. They actually do melt. They actually have departed, and that obviously is tragic in every way. Let's though still treat with respect, as we are trying to treat all of these sections and all of the poems of Leaves of Grass with respect. By the way, guys, this will be the last time that we stumble across passages of Leaves of Grass and we find ourselves in a bit of a conundrum. How can we celebrate a writer who is going to be for us controversial in this way? And this won't be the last time. We're going to see this in other areas of American culture. We don't run from it. We want to treat it with grace and with respect. Let's begin. Notice, he says, on my way a moment I pause. In other words, America and American democracy for Whitman is a process that is evolving. Again, the Darwinian perspective. It's ongoing and it should be celebrated. But here, notice he's going to pause. Now, why is he going to pause? Because he's obviously got to address the issue of the increasingly vanishing peoples who were here long before certain Europeans showed up to begin the process of what he will consider the great nation of America, right? And then he'll pause and he'll say, here for you, exclamation point, and here for America. And we pointed out, he doesn't use the word America very often. We saw it in inscriptions with I Hear America Singing and a few other times. It doesn't get used much. As I said to you, when he uses it, it is an important element of how and why he is bringing up the word America. Notice he says, still the present I raise aloft like a flag, right? Still the future of the states I harbinge, which is to say foretell, glad and sublime. And then he says it. And for the past, and this will obviously be his use of the word aborigine here, for the past I pronounce what the air holds of the Red Aborigines. Now, obviously we can't read something like this in our course of study without thinking about, for example, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which will resurrect other kinds of similar types of racist questions for us. By the way, just to point out, notice how in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Marlowe will pause through the story and he'll make some kind of reflection and he'll take us right back into the story that he's telling regarding his search for Kurds. We have a pause here that will happen. I think it's clear that Whitman all his life struggled with, on the one hand, wanting to celebrate the amazing majesty of what America and the American civilization was able to accomplish. But on the other hand, to lament the passing of so much that came before. And here he'll call it the Red Aborigines. Now, the use of the word red, I'll let you run this to ground in terms of that as an adjective to describe a given group of peoples. Obviously, it's obviously racist, but it's deeply embedded in the American psyche. And of course, texts like "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee" for us will be one of those texts among many that we study in 303 that will address the questions, so many questions about this kind of language. Notice it's repeated, and then the use of the word leaving, and as I've pointed out to you already in our study of inscriptions, that use of that word is interesting in a title, a book of poems called Leaves of Grass, right? Leaving natural breath. Now this will be, for Whitman, celebrations of the native as being somehow closer to nature. Think about your Rousseau and all of that in Social Contract, we've talked about it. Think about our references in Thoreau's Walden to similar kinds of things, as well as Emerson to a lesser degree. Natural breaths, sounds of rain and winds, calls as of birds and animals in the woods. In other words, native peoples, he's going to argue, living so much closer to nature and to the land. Syllabled is an interesting verb here to us for names. Now, of course, the tragedy is that the names that he's going to now provide us with are all but forgotten names by and large, other than to be names of places. Ironically, the large city in Florida named Miami, and yet the Miami native peoples who came from further north. The Oconee here are coming from Georgia. I'll just go through this list really quickly. The little bit that I can say about this, they would join the Seminole tribe in the 1700s. Coosa from Georgia, Ottawa from the northeastern part of the United States, Monongalia from Pennsylvania, Sauk from Green Bay, Wisconsin, the Natchez from the lower Mississippi Valley, Chattahoochee, of course, Georgia, Coqueta. We have very little information about. Oronco from the Minnesota area, maybe. Wabash from the Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio region. Miami, the north central Indiana, southwest Michigan, and in Ohio, western Ohio area. The Saginaw and the Chippewa from the Michigan area of today, the Oshkosh from Wisconsin, and then Walla Walla from the Columbia River, northeastern Oregon and southeastern Washington. Now, these are the names that are provided for us here as peoples, and he, of course, will qualify them as names as well, in many cases, places as well. In our listing of these 15, in our now mentioning them, we are reminded, of course, of a nation's history where millions, literally, of people were living and surviving, struggling to survive, when, of course, by the time Whitman is giving this list, most of these names are pretty foreign to his readers. They're only known as the other, right? Those who came before. And that's kind of how he says it. Notice he comes back to the word leaving for the second time here. Leaving such to the states capitalized, they, obviously all of these references to the Aborigines, as he will refer to them, they melt the names, they depart. This is, of course, kind of tragic language here. Charging is an interesting word. The water and the land with names. So 2 times here he will reference the idea of names. As I said to you guys at the beginning in our conversation about this section, it is a problematic section. This won't be the last time, by the way, that we'll pick up Leaves of Grass and say, you know, I've been able to kind of cruise thus far through most of this. I mean, I get it, his incredible optimism of America and some of those kind of things. But how are you going to deal with the fact that even now, when you Google so many of those 15 names, there's virtually nothing that you can find that will explain who these people were, what were they about, and what can we know about them to celebrate them. Let's finish at 2a. Well, obviously, this is the tragedy. There is so much majesty in our nation's history. This is one of those serious tragedies that can quickly go unremembered if we don't stumble across a set of lines like this and say, wait a minute, that's 15 names of important tribes and peoples we know virtually nothing about anymore. How is that possible? Right? Obviously, I think we as well have to say it out loud. Whitman was clearly struggling with, on the one hand, celebrating American civilization and democracy, and on the other hand, obviously recognizing the nature of the conquering element and how tragic that was. Of course, at 2b, all the foreign names are an important element at of the game that he's playing. The repetition of the word leaving, obviously, and the repetition of the word names. At 3a, there's just so many titles that come to mind here. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, we already mentioned. I just want to mention the work that's so sacred for us in room 303 of Leslie Mormon Silko. Her text, Lullaby, Almanac of the Dead. I mean, there's just anything that she's written, I think, is so central to our study here. I also want to mention as well Joy Harrow's classic text, When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through. This is the Norton Anthology of Native Nations Poetry, and there's probably no text in 303 for us that deals with this issue that's more sacred than that one. I certainly would recommend it to you. Find the text and then obviously read the text. No question that we come back to that text with sadness, obviously horror, shame. No question that that's a part of our nation's history. We're not going to run from it in 303. We're going to say it out loud. Certainly is a tragedy, no question about it. And yet, out of that tragedy comes, as Whitman will argue in Leaves of Grass, will come something that can make a greater struggle necessary, as he'll say at the conclusion of Song of the Open Road. Finally, at 3b, and this is a kind of a self-evidence form of the way we can own a text like this, how do you feel about Native Americans and Native peoples in general that have to deal with, in a world history and in an American history, the tragedy of exclusion, of extermination often? How do you deal with that? And then, of course, more importantly, how do we move on beyond it? I mean, if we are the stories we tell and retell, and we are the stories that we decide to accept or reject, how do you personally deal with that? And of course, can we forgive Whitman and his racist position here as a victim of his time? Does that work for you? Or are you more inclined to say, you know what, I was with you right up until passage 16 of starting from Paumanok, and I'm going to set down Leaves of Grass and I won't pick it up again. I think that's a mistake. I'm going to try and make that argument through our reading of all of Leaves of Grass's poems. I think that's a mistake for any number of other texts that we'll study where we're offended and then we say, well, you know what, I think I'm going to hold him responsible for this position. He should have been more enlightened. He should have been able to say it out loud, and he didn't. And to that degree, I'm going to set out his text and never come back to it. How are you going to deal with this? I would recommend to you David Reynolds' really fine biography of Whitman. Walt Whitman's America is the title. And especially the relationship that Whitman had with George Catlin, who is an important artist. The poem Osceola of Whitman, we're going to come back to that as well. I challenge you, though, to stay with us with Talks with Walt. We're going to see all of the sides of Walt Whitman, and of course, in the process, all the sides of America as well. Thank you.